All right, friends, so you have heard part of the story of Pentecost. Normally, we would read the story of Pentecost in Acts as told to us by Luke, but you've just heard most of it, and so I'm just going to share one little thing, and then we're going to hear from the gospel writer Mark. So in addition to these folks being able to understand one another, it says that they were speaking specifically about the things that God had been doing in their lives. So it was more than just casual chit-chat. They were sharing about the ways they had experienced God in their lives. And then when the Spirit came and helped them understand each other, some folks said, because it was weird, right? All of a sudden you can understand people that you couldn't understand before. And some people said, oh, they're just drunk, right? And Peter said, they're not drunk, it's too early in the morning, right? As if that stops everybody from thinking, I don't know. But then Peter went on to say, it's not that they're drunk. It's like the prophet said, that God's Spirit is going to pour out on all people. Not just old men, but also women and children. That God's Spirit is going to be poured out on all people. And that God's saving power will be known in them. So the story of Pentecost is about a festival. And it's about the inclusiveness and the diversity of God's power in God's people. So now let us hear from the gospel writer Mark in continuing our way through Mark's gospel. This story, which I think also is of the Pentecost birthday spirit. Jesus called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. And unclean spirits were just anything that was not of God, right? Authority over that which was not of God. And Jesus said to them, when sending them out in 2s, wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. And if any town will not welcome you, and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that's on your feet as a testimony. So they went out by 2s with oil and anointed people who were sick, and was God's healing presence to many. I invite us to rest in that story for a moment. Amen. 9 years ago, Spirit blew. Spirit breathed, created. As in the early days of creation, where the Spirit hovered over and created diversity, plant life, animal life, human life. Not just one kind of bird, or one kind of plant, or one kind of animal, or one kind of person, but many different people. Like the Spirit hovered and created back in the very beginning, 9 years ago, the Spirit hovered and created this community that we call Downtown Disciples. It started with one, sort of. The Spirit nudged me to give the church another chance because I was on my way out. I loved the stories of Jesus. I was raised in the faith, in the stories of Jesus, but I was not happy with the way Jesus' movement was being lived out in some parts of the church. In exclusiveness and condemnation and judging and being more about a building than about Jesus' movement. So I was on my way out until a little church in, of all places, Council Bluffs, restored my faith in church when the region asked me to go service just as an interim, because I had said, I'm going to work with Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and I was doing some contracting work for them, and I was not going to, particularly be involved in pastoring anymore, I thought. And so this little church in Council Bluffs, who had a couple of lesbian leaders on their board, and who served over 100 people a free meal every Wednesday, no strings attached, just come if you're hungry. They were doing church on Wednesday night, and it wasn't organized church, it was people gathering, eating, praying for each other, talking. It was church. But it wasn't what happened on Sunday morning. And do you know what the miraculous thing was? They didn't, this is what I did not hear. Well, we got to get those people to come on Sunday morning. Which is what you would normally expect, right? No, they were just delighted to be engaged in the work of the Spirit. And I thought, good heavens, if they can do that in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Pardon, sorry. Western Iowa, not the most liberal place in the state. Not that any part is very liberal anymore. But I thought, if they could do it in Council Bluffs, there surely have to be people in Des Moines. So I went to our denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and said, I have this idea. Would like for you to come along with me on it. I don't want to be some rogue pastor off by herself doing some weird thing. And they said, yes. And I was amazed. I made it super easy on them. I said, I'm not asking for any money right now. I might later. I might come back. But first I just want to see if there are other people who are hungry to be a Christ-filled community, a Spirit-filled community, but to be inclusive and unapologetically progressive. That was the language I used. I said, I want to be unapologetically progressive. They said, you might offend some people. I said, yep. I'm not going to offend the people I'm looking for, right? So they said, okay. I said, if we get something going, I'll come back and ask for money. But in the meantime, I just want to be part of the group, right? I want to be part of the Disciples of Christ. So we said, okay, Downtown Disciples, that sounds like a good name. We'll go with that. And we started meeting at the end of January in the Des Moines Social Club. We're reading a book together called Saving Jesus from the Church. I thought, that ought to gather up the folks I'm looking for. Saving Jesus from the Church by Robin Myers. And do you know what? People came. People like Kyle came. And he's still here. It's like amazing, right? Kyle's been with us since the very, very beginning. Some of you come to Bible Geeks. Bob from Bible Geeks, one of our very first folks who came and gathered with us around that book. Some of you know Angela Rothfuss, one of the very first people who came and gathered with us. Some pastor friends of mine, Alice and John Bolin, and some others, and a guy named Jerry Crenshaw. started gathering together. And so then it wasn't one. And I'm not exaggerating about this. I have notes. I took notes, and I found our first report that we gave to the region. 12 people. There were 12 people who gathered that first time. And then we read a book, and then we read another book. And then the Spirit moved among us and started sending us out, 2 by 2, out into Des Moines to listen and to serve and to be a healing, affirming, inclusive, justice-making presence in the world. First, somebody said, hey, the shelter's right down the street. Why don't we go see if they need anything? So Felicia Hilton and I went down and got certified to be at their health window. And this is how we were a healing presence. We handed out Band-Aids, because when you're housing insecure, you do a lot of walking and you get some blisters. We handed out Band-Aids and socks and lots of other things at that health counter. But mostly what we did was listen. And we were honored to listen. And later, that expanded into what Bill shared with us earlier, Joppa. 2 by 2, and 3s, and 4s. We started going out. And then, I said to Jerry, hey, we should walk in that Pride Parade. This was June 2015, our very first Pride Parade. And Jerry and I were in our Downtown Disciple t-shirts, and we walked with Urbandale UCC, who generously allowed us to walk with them in our first Pride Parade. And it just grew from there. Then we began serving meals with Rock Power Pizza, who used to open up their restaurant to anyone for a free meal once a week. And we went there and we served meals. We served a meal, cooked and served a meal at Central Iowa Shelter Services. We did one at Ronald McDonald House, and serving families whose children were sick. We began to listen to the Spirit moving among us and calling us to not only listen to one another, but to listen to the community and the Spirit in the community. And then someone said, hey, I have an idea. Let's go to that laundromat. Kid you not, it's right down the road here on University. A laundromat, and we did what we called Laundry Love, where we went to the laundromat and we gave out quarters for the machines and laundry detergent and fruit and juice and coffee, and we took children's books, and we just hung out at the laundromat, listening to people and having the honor and privilege to be a joyful presence in a place that can sometimes be a little drab. And I could talk all day about all the things that Spirit began to do, but before we knew it, there weren't just 2 of us, 3 of us, or 12 of us. There were more, and people began to say, hey, when are we going to worship? And that's when I knew we had a church. So I went back to the denomination then and said, okay, you remember that money I said I didn't want, but I was coming back for? I'm here. And they blessed us to be able to have our first year of funding and to help us out for 3 years. And then the Spirit blew and grew us, and we have become a fully self-sustaining community that shares so much with the world. Our scripture today from Mark says that Jesus called people, not a lot of people, a few, to go out and be God's healing presence in the world. And he gave them some specific instructions. He said, and they were simple instructions. Number 1, don't pack a big bag. Leave your big suitcase at home. Which, Kate's learned this. Several of us have learned this. If you're going to go on a Camino, a long journey, it's good not to pack a big bag because you're carrying that thing with you. Don't pack a big bag, Jesus said. He said, just wear your sandals and take a staff. Don't even take 2 tunics. Now, this would be a hard lesson for people in our time and place, right? The shoes and the staff actually symbolized some things in Jesus' culture. The sandals represented dignity. Take your dignity with you. Don't go barefoot. Take your dignity along with you. And take your staff, which is a sign of authority. Because Jesus gave them authority. Authority to be his healing presence. Authority to speak his truth. His justice-making, inclusive, affirming love of God. With authority. Sandals and a staff. That's all you need, Jesus said. Because you're going to depend on the hospitality of strangers. Oh, wow. That's tough in our culture. We have learned that we need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and make sure that we have plenty of stuff to get by, right? Don't be needy. Don't ask for any help. Just be self-sufficient. Accumulate a bunch of stuff so that you don't get yourself in a vulnerable position where you might have to ask for a little help. That was not Jesus' message. And it's a hard message for us in our time and our place. To remember that God calls us to take risks, to be vulnerable, to be willing to accept hospitality. I learned this over and over again in my life, but I learned it recently when we were planning our Mother's Day luncheon for peace in Gaza. And one of our community members, Fatma, asked me, what are we doing as a hospitality gift for our speaker? And I'm like, oh. And she says, I have a suggestion if it's okay. I'm like, yes, please. So she recommended, and some of you might remember from last week, she recommended a Palestinian baker. And so I said, yeah, that's great. So reached out through Etsy to this Palestinian baker and ordered some cookies, Palestinian cookies for our guest speaker. And then I went to pick them up. And my plan was go, because we'd already paid for them online, go pick them up and then go do your other long list of things to do for the day, right? That was my plan. I went, I knocked on the door, and she answers the door and says, come in. So I did. And then she says, sit down. So I did. And then she said, would you like some coffee? And I said, yes. And then she goes to the counter and she takes a plate and starts putting cookies on the plate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to eat all these cookies. 6. And she sits down these delicious cookies that she made, that she's so proud of course. And it says, eat, right? And so I'm eating cookies, and she begins to open up her life to me. And I'm so blessed to hear about her, get this, 12 children. 12. Who live in different parts of the world, all around the world. And then she told me about her 20 grandchildren. Then she says, oh, I'd like for you to talk to my daughter. So she calls her daughter, and then I get to speak with her daughter for a while. And then she asks me to give the phone back to her mom, which I do, and she tells her mom, get her another box of cookies. So I brought them to church last week and shared them with the children and with all of you. Hospitality. It was such a blessing to be invited into her life. And her husband came through, walked through, and he says to me, you are my sister, and I am your brother, and she is your sister, and you are always welcome here. Wow. Yeah. Wow. That's what the Spirit does, right? Jesus said, be willing to stay a while. Boy, I have to be reminded of that lesson over and over again, but that experience will stay with me for a long time and will remind me to stay a while. Jesus said, receive the hospitality of God. And then there will be times, he said, that you might not be so welcome. When that happens, just shake the dust off of your shoes and move on. Don't pull out your weapons. Don't start a war. Let it go. Because, you know, in Jesus' time and place, hospitality was huge. And one of the reasons hospitality was so huge was it stopped violence. Because when strangers came into the community, if you welcomed them and fed them and cared for them, chances of a war was a lot less. Be willing to stay a while, but there will be times and places that you will not be welcome. So shake off the dust and move on. You know, at Downtown Disciples, we've had some experiences where our message wasn't particularly welcome everywhere we went. But sometimes it was. Because, you know, when the Spirit called us, the Spirit didn't always call us to acts of hospitality and mercy. Sometimes the Spirit called us to speak the truth to power. And I wanted to share a couple of our early memories with you about that. And John Noble, who I met at that first Pride Fest, and who quickly became a leader in our community. John said to me one day, or to us, that, you know, racial justice is a problem, injustice is a problem in this community, and we need to do something about it. And I said, okay, all right. And we had a member, Felicia, a member of our community, who said, you know, really the best thing that y'all can do, not me, she said, you, white folk, can do, is talk to the chief of police, talk to your student council, or city council, and talk to the mayor. about policing in this community. We had another community member who would tell me about her grandson. Her family was very racially diverse, and her grandson would get pulled over every time he left his grandpa's house because his grandpa lived in a wealthier white neighborhood and he was black. Every time he left his grandpa's house, he would get pulled over by the police. Not because he was doing anything wrong, because he was black driving in a white neighborhood. So we reached out to the mayor and the chief of police and city council members, and one city council person, Chris Coleman, responded, and the mayor responded, and by golly, we got to sit down with all three of them. I said, I think they thought we were a gay church. But we got to sit down with them. And John did most of the talking, thankfully, because he is great at this. And we talked to them about body cameras and training, unconscious bias training. And you know, it didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. So sometimes, I'm not saying it's fixed, but please don't hear me say that it's fixed. There's still work to do, and we still have the ear of some city council folk, and a mayor, and we're gonna still keep working on these things. And we won't always see the results of everything we want immediately. And sometimes, some places we go, we really just won't be welcome. And we'll shake off the dust and we'll move along. But the Spirit, you see, is at work in that. So Jesus said, travel light, take your dignity, take your authority. Don't go alone, go together. You know, when we go together, we get to lean on each other. We get to learn from each other. You see, I love our diversity in our community, and not just for the sake of diversity. It's not just that we're all that, or we're woke, or whatever. It's that the Spirit loves diversity. Started out with those animals, creatures, people. And in our diversity, you see, the Spirit moves. Because the diversity of the Spirit didn't end at creation. We could tell all kinds of stories about God's diversity. Pentecost is one of them. Got people speaking in different languages, understanding each other, but it didn't stop there either. Paul said that we have diverse gifts. We don't all have the same gifts. We need the diversity in our community because we all bring different gifts for God's work in the world, for God's saving, healing, justice making, affirming. So when we go out together, not only does our work increase because of the diversity, we learn and grow from each other. And we lean on one another. In that diversity, we grow. I believe that the work that Spirit has always been doing continues in this community. And I cannot wait until next year when we celebrate our 10th birthday. And what I want to hear is the diverse stories of all that Spirit is doing and has done in you. And in the people we have yet to meet. in this neighborhood, in this community. Spirit blew and birthed something 9 years ago, and Spirit isn't done yet. Amen. You're fine, I'm just used to going around.